There will be midterm elections in the United States soon. However, President Trump keeps hinting at the possibility of declaring a national emergency using the elections as a reason.
President Trump has not directly ruled out the possibility of declaring a national emergency over the 2026 midterm elections, raising tensions in American politics. President Trump is linking election management issues to the authority of the federal government. In particular, whether the SAVE Act currently being discussed in the US Congress will pass has emerged as an important variable. This bill requires proof of US citizenship during the federal voter registration process and mandates the presentation of a photo ID during voting. President Trump and the MAGA faction within the Republican Party argue that this is a key measure to strengthen election security.
On the other hand, Democrats and some election experts oppose this, arguing that stricter proof of citizenship and ID requirements could limit voter participation for those who have difficulty preparing the necessary document.
Currently, the Senate has postponed handling the bill until after the August recess, and the Senate is scheduled to reconvene on September 14. President Trump has indicated that if action on the bill continues to be delayed, he will consider responses at the executive level rather than through the legislative process in Congress. In particular, when conservative commentator Wayne Root argued that if a national emergency is declared, the administration could push for photo ID, proof of citizenship, and restrictions on mail-in voting at the executive level, President Trump did not clearly deny this. President Trump responded by saying that even stranger things have happened, but he refrained from commenting on any specific plans. Although this statement does not mean that any actual executive action has been decided, the fact that the president is publicly mentioning emergency powers related to elections is causing major controversy in the political world. The Trump administration is already engaged in ongoing legal battles with federal courts over mail-in voting. President Trump ordered the United States Postal Service to restrict the delivery of mail-in and absentee ballots in states that do not provide voter list-related data, but several states and courts have raised issues with the administration's actions. Some appellate court decisions have given the administration room to push its policies, but in other areas, existing court restrictions remain in place, making the legal situation even more complicated. Because of this, if a national emergency is actually declared, the biggest issue is expected to be what legal authority the president will have. Because the US election system gives significant authority to state governments, if the president tries to use a state of emergency as grounds to have the federal government take control of the entire midterm election process, a specific legal basis would be required. Congress also has means to limit the president's actions, but it may require enough seats to override a presidential veto, so political conflict is expected. Therefore, this statement is being interpreted not as President Trump declaring a national emergency right away, but rather as showing what measures the administration could consider if the SAVE Act is not passed by Congress. However, the fact that the president directly linked election issues with a national security emergency just a few months before the midterm elections is likely to further intensify political debate in the United States. First, let's take a look at what kind of debates are currently happening in American politics. As President Trump has not ruled out the possibility of a national emergency, there are completely different interpretations of his statement in the United States. On one side, there are suspicions that President Trump is considering declaring a national emergency, similar to martial law, in anticipation of the possibility that the Republican Party may be at a disadvantage in the November midterm elections. There are claims that he's emphasizing the possibility of problems arising during the election process in advance, so that if any controversy occurs after the actual election, he can use this as a basis to respond. This interpretation is especially being raised because President Trump has continuously questioned the credibility of American elections in the past. On the other hand, those who support President Trump's approach argue that there are real loopholes in the US election management system, so measures to address them are necessary. A representative example is the recent voter registration list error found in New Jersey.
In New Jersey, it was confirmed that due to a software error between 2023 and 2024, 6,600 non-US citizens were mistakenly registered as voters.
In the government's initial investigation, it was found that fewer than 400 of them actually voted in the election. This incident has sparked considerable controversy in American politics. The Trump administration and the Republican Party are strengthening their claims that there are problems with the current voter registration system, citing the fact that non-citizens were registered on the voter rolls and some of them actually voted. On the other hand, New Jersey officials stated that this was an administrative issue caused by a software error, and there is no evidence that the election results were changed because of this incident. In fact, we need to distinguish between the claim that about 6,600 people were wrongly registered and the claim that thousands voted illegally. The actual number confirmed to have voted is currently less than 400. However, for President Trump, this incident itself is an important political basis. The Trump administration is using this case to argue for the necessity of the SAVE Act. The White House also cited the New Jersey error as a reason to strengthen citizenship verification procedures. On top of this, as the federal government moves to directly verify each state's voter rolls, there is a clash in the US between those who argue that election security needs to be strengthened and those who claim that the federal government is focusing too much on and excessively interfering with state election management.
According to a recent Reuters report, the Trump administration has been pursuing lawsuits to obtain detailed voter rolls from several states, but the courts have repeatedly blocked these efforts.
Therefore, the current debate in the United States is a mix of two issues: whether large-scale election fraud actually occurred, and how to prevent administrative errors that exist in the election system. Those who support President Trump argue that, since actual errors have been confirmed in the New Jersey case, citizenship verification and identity checks should be strengthened.
On the other hand, opponents argue that just because some registration errors have been found, it does not mean that the entire US election system is being widely manipulated.
as these conflicting claims clash. And with President Trump even mentioning the possibility of a national emergency, political tensions in the US surrounding the November midterm elections are rising even higher. And we also need to take a look at the SAVE Act. Many people think that in the US, they hand out ballots without checking IDs, but it's not that they don't check IDs. In the US, election rules differ by state. Some states require a photo ID, while others don't require an ID at all. In those states, there are separate identity verification procedures, and as long as you pass those, you can vote. The main purpose of the SAVE Act is to unify the different identity verification standards of each state at the federal level with stronger regulations. However, public opinion on this is very divided. Supporters of the SAVE Act argue that, as in the case of New Jersey, there have been instances where people without citizenship were mistakenly registered on voter rolls and even actually voted. Because of this, they insist that there is a need to more strongly unify the different voter verification procedures across states.
The Republican Party believes that by verifying citizenship at the voter registration stage and checking identity during the voting process, it is possible to reduce the chances of non-citizens voting or people voting using someone else's identity.
In particular, their logic is that even a single vote cast by an ineligible person must be prevented in order to maintain public trust in the election results. There is also a political aspect to this.
The Republican Party and President Trump are emphasizing the principle that only American citizens should vote in US elections, making the SAVE Act a key agenda item.
This issue can rally the MAGA supporters because it simultaneously touches on election security and illegal immigration, both of which are important to conservative voters. In particular, President Trump has continuously raised doubts about the election process, so the argument for stricter voter identification aligns with his political message. On the other hand, opponents are pointing out completely different issues. Democrats and civic groups argue that if ID and citizenship proof requirements are strengthened, American citizens who are actually eligible to vote could face unnecessary obstacles in the voting process. In particular, there may be people among low-income or elderly groups who have difficulty obtaining necessary documents like a passport or birth certificate, and even if they have a common ID like a driver's license, they could be required to provide additional documents to prove their citizenship. There is also the issue of names and personal information not matching. In the United States, there are quite a few people who have changed their last name after marriage or divorce, or who have gone through a name change process in the past. If the name registered on the voter list is different from the name on the citizenship documents, additional verification procedures may be required, and there are concerns that eligible voters could face difficulties due to administrative issues during this process. And there are claims that people who have the right to vote might not be able to exercise their voting rights because of these administrative procedures. Another key issue is the federal government's access to personal information.
If the SAVE Act is implemented, the federal government could obtain voter information that has been managed by state governments, and the process of cross-checking this data with the Department of Homeland Security's records could be expanded.
Opponents are concerned that if the federal government checks not only names and addresses, but also citizenship-related information on a large scale, it could lead to privacy issues. Actually, South Korea is somewhat unique in this regard, since every citizen is assigned a resident registration number. However, in the United States, even just collecting this kind of information often faces strong opposition. For now, that's why there's still no conclusion regarding the SAVE Act. However, since President Trump has hinted at declaring a national emergency if the SAVE Act doesn't pass before the midterm elections, I think American politics could become quite chaotic going forward. And now comes the important part. The Senate will reopen on September 14th. At that time, it will be decided whether the SAVE Act will move forward again, or if another measure, as President Trump mentioned, will actually come into play. There isn't much time left until the US midterm elections. If the controversy surrounding the election expands into a national security issue, the United States could see a situation where the White House, state governments, Congress, and the courts all clash simultaneously over election management authority.